Hi everyone, I'm Jack Crawford, and it's time to review Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice by FromSoftware. Like many people, I've become a big fan of FromSoftware in recent years thanks to Demon Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborne. Action RPGs with harsh but beautiful worlds that are so satisfying to explore. But their focus seems to have been shifting away from world building over time. With each new game, director Hidetaka Miyazaki seems more interested in the action elements and less interested in the adventure elements. Sekiro continues that trend, doing away with much of the character building. There is a skill tree which lets you specialize a little bit, but it's not game changing like building a knight versus a sorcerer in Dark Souls. Exploration also feels completely different. The areas are generally quite simple by FromSoft standards, and your increased mobility means you can play carelessly, sprinting through mobs of enemies, picking up treasure, then grappling to safety. Grappling does feel nice, and the levels can still be somewhat enjoyable to explore, especially the ones with lots of verticality. But it's a far cry from Dark Souls, which made me feel tiny and helpless in a confusing but fascinating world. Dark Souls makes me explore very carefully, and that caution is often rewarded because there are so many interesting surprises in the level design. The areas are also brilliantly interconnected, the world design is amazingly cohesive. Sekiro, on the other hand, has some pretty lame areas. The poison swamp is getting really old at this point, and it feels like they just put it in every game for the sake of it. The shortcuts between disparate areas must operate under some form of magic because they connect areas that are ridiculously far apart. This one, toward the beginning of the game in a cave, takes you near the top of an absurdly faraway mountain. There's not even much reason for these shortcuts to exist since you have fast travel from the beginning. It feels disrespectful, like they're trying to pull a cheap trick to make the world seem more tightly designed than it is. The abandoned dungeon is disappointingly small and uninteresting. The hidden forest and Mibu village were pretty tedious to explore because the enemy types there had gotten old long before I got there. Repetition is a big issue with bosses as well. Most of the bosses I encountered in the latter half of my first playthrough were repeats, which killed a lot of my motivation to explore. Then, toward the end, the state of the world changed, and I found myself exploring large areas over again. Looking back, it's disappointing how padded the world feels when it's not even that big compared to Dark Souls, for instance. On top of all this, there aren't that many interesting character interactions either, especially if you just count the ones you can reasonably be expected to find without looking them up. For some reason, a lot of really important optional stuff is a bit too well hidden this time around. But although the adventure elements were disappointing for FromSoft, the game still had its moments. I distinctly remember walking into this temple for the first time. I was warned about this area, so I'm already on edge. I hear some creepy noise from inside, which spooks me. I carefully engage, thinking I can handle these three enemies, then this big boy pops out. There was a steady escalation of tension, then afterwards I jumped out to safety and it was nice and calm again. The whole sequence had a nice flow to it. I also liked the giant serpent and a handful of other bizarre, hilarious moments that reminded me this is a FromSoft game. But like I said, Sekiro is clearly more about the action. The combat is a significant departure from their previous games. First of all, you have no stamina bar, so you can attack endlessly. However, you do have a posture bar, which limits how much you can block. Enemies, including bosses, have posture bars as well, and usually the goal of a fight is to break their posture so you can deliver a death blow. Instead of the typical parry system, you'll deflect enemy attacks if you block at just the right time. Afterward, you can counterattack for significant posture damage. The combat system works best with a single human opponent, when you're attacking constantly, deflecting as necessary, and dealing with other special attacks when they come up, but always keeping up the pressure until you break their posture. For me, this was the best part of Sekiro by far. When you're up against a tough boss in a FromSoft game, you have to learn their behavior really well. Then you can fight them in a sort of zen state. The feeling of being in that state is an amazing fit for this game. You feel like a master samurai in an intense sword battle, responding perfectly to everything your enemy does, knowing that one wrong move could lead to your death. There were a few bosses that really capitalized on this feeling and brought minor twists to the table to keep things fresh. The last boss of my first playthrough was especially memorable. I also liked the expanded combat toolset used to spice up these fights. You're rewarded for not just deflecting, but sometimes dodging, sometimes jumping and kicking, sometimes sprinting. It is odd, though, that so many different types of attacks are marked by the same perilous symbol. It's not really that helpful to know that something scary is happening when it could be two completely different attacks that require two completely different responses. There are other minor issues with the system. For instance, it's easy to mash the block button to get some free deflects. Overall, though, this particular type of fight definitely works. I also liked that there were a couple of bizarre gimmick-based bosses that served as a nice change of pace. One of these was a very cool set piece that came at just the right time in the story. Unfortunately, most of the bosses weren't so great. Some felt like they were ripped straight out of Bloodborne, and I was already sick of that kind of boss by the end of that game. Big enemies that you have to dodge around and learn their intentionally weird attack patterns. Except in Sekiro, you sprint to dodge because you are ridiculously fast in this game. Early on, I learned I can practically outrun a horse, which trivialized this boss. And it turns out you can trivialize most bosses by sprinting. All you have to do is stay out of their range and wait for them to do an attack, then you can run in, punish it, and run back out. It's extremely easy and boring to do, and it shouldn't be possible, at least not for the majority of bosses in the game. You can remove half of most bosses' health using obvious, cheesy stealth strategies that aren't very fun to do, especially if you die and have to try again. There are a few boss fights with multiple difficult enemies, which is definitely not this game's strength. The boss fights also suffer from many of the more minor problems that have plagued FromSoft games for a while now. Janky camera issues, losing lock-on at the worst possible time, getting stuck on the environment. That last one is particularly frustrating because of a new issue with ledges in Sekiro. You can no longer walk or dodge off a ledge, you have to jump or sprint. This kind of hand-holding feels totally out of place in a challenging game that wants me to take it seriously. It can be an issue in combat when you're trying to get away, but it's actually just as frustrating when exploring. It feels wrong when you can't drop off naturally, and it doesn't help that the jumping and sprinting can both be very awkward to control. I've talked mostly about bosses because combat with smaller enemies is never a highlight. With few exceptions, one regular enemy is trivial, while a group of regular enemies is obnoxious. The Souls games got good use out of regular enemies by using them in consistently surprising ways. In Sekiro, it's mostly basic setups where the challenge is to use stealth to pick off as many enemies as possible before taking on the rest. Just like for the boss fights, I often felt the game was encouraging me to take on a boring, uninteresting playstyle to deal with these groups. It's easy to get a stealth kill, run away and wait for everyone to reset, then repeat the process until only one or two enemies are left. Fortunately, the prosthetic tools make group fights bearable. A couple of them are useful for bosses as well. In fact, there are a few attacks I never figured out how to avoid consistently without Mistraven. But mostly I use them for groups. I like the variety, and they're very well balanced. I will say, though, the upgrade system definitely could have been simplified, and I feel the same way about the skill trees. The options aren't as consistently exciting and useful as I would have hoped, and that's even more true for the combat arts. There are over a dozen combat arts, and while they're all interesting in concept, only a few are ever really worth using. Then there's Ichimonji, which is a little too good. There's not much reason to use a complicated move that costs spirit emblems when there's a very powerful, easy-to-use one that's completely free. I don't have too much to say about the story. It's serviceable, but nothing to write home about. I do like how the setting stands out from Bloodborne and the Souls games, and these kinds of environments suit the movement and traversal systems well. The art direction is pretty good, and the elegant animations for combat are particularly impressive. All of your movements and all of the enemies' movements look so perfectly natural. I'm also a big fan of how the weather and time of day change as you progress through the game. It does so much to make the world feel more alive. I'm always wanting more stuff like that in games. The music is fairly prominent for a FromSoft game, but it makes sense for the tone and pace of this game. It's trying to be more exciting and in your face. The rhythmic sword clanging sounds are forever burned into my memory. The grappling sound is also extremely satisfying, and there were other memorable audio moments as well, like one particular enemy that made a very strong and hilarious first impression. I like what they did with New Game Plus. You have the option of making the game extra difficult in the best way possible. You take some damage through blocks. I found this was the perfect challenge for my second playthrough. It made me play closer to the most fun playstyle, the one that ends fights quickly because you're using every enemy move to your advantage. It also punishes you for spamming the block button for free deflects. Overall, I enjoyed my second playthrough more, but that's only because I sprinted and jumped past 99% of the enemies to get to the fun parts. Other typical FromSoft features return as well. You have what's essentially an Estus flask, and you rest at what are essentially bonfires. You find lots of random items as you progress, which can help you a little bit. This all works fine, it's tried and true, but it all contributes to a feeling that they're blindly copying this structure and using it in every game, even when it doesn't make sense. Strangely, some of the changes they did make seem aimless, like the unseen aid mechanic. Instead of returning to the spot you died to recover what you lost, you permanently lose half your money when you die, unless you get lucky, in which case you lose nothing. I get that the standard wouldn't really work here because it's so easy to run past everything that you would almost always be getting your stuff back, but this new system feels too punishing. The game should be encouraging me to learn from trial and error, not avoid death at all costs. They've also opted for the traditional approach of separate money and experience points, doing away with the wonderfully simple unified currency of their previous games. This game was a mixed bag for me. I didn't dislike any of my time with it, but usually when I wasn't fighting a human boss 1v1, it felt like the shell of a better FromSoft game. It doesn't help that they've made several games in this style, so the ideas are getting a bit old at this point. I wish they had focused on the unique appeal of this idea by making a short boss rush, then moving on to the next project. And I'm giving Sekiro Shadows Die Twice a 6 out of 10. Let me know in the comments what you think of this one. I know a bunch of you guys have played it, and I know people like it more than I do, so tell me why. Feel free to suggest any other 2019 games or new games for me to review. Check out my other videos if you haven't already. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.